And it's time to catch up with our Director of Carbon Intelligence, Tyler Cole, to talk all about sustainability. Tyler, thanks for being here.
Happy Monday, y'all. 3 weeks till Earth Day.
Hey, 3 weeks till Earth Day, 3 weeks until our net zero carbon event, which I think we should talk about a little bit. We really haven't dug quite into it other than telling people to go to live.freightwaves.com and get registered for it. So let's start talking off there about the event a little bit. What are you excited for? What can we expect out of it?
Definitely. It's coming on Earth Day, April 22nd. It's a virtual event, so go ahead and get registered now. But we will cover a fairly broad range of topics. It's bigger every year as climate change impacts more and more of us. So we're seeing more and more interest from sponsors and from speakers really to explain what their companies are doing. So I would tell listeners to check it out. It's going to be a great event covering everything from new technologies to decarbonize freight and logistics to policies that are going to incent that. They won't want to miss it.
Perfect. You know, I'm always looking for those new technologies, Kaylee, so I'm looking forward to this one as well. Tyler, when we're jumping in today's topic, it's one that I find very interesting, really pledges versus action, because a lot of times we can talk the talk, but can we also walk the walk? There seems to be a lot of activity with pledges, but we're still seeing carbon emissions at really all-time highs. Is that right?
It's true. Yeah, we need to see urgent action coming out of all sectors. And there is a bit of nuance here that's important to understand. So when you say talk the talk and walk the walk, we got to understand that it's a generally complex issue. We can boil it down to, hey, stop emitting. But we can see, we did that during the pandemic, and nobody wants to relive that again because that means we don't get to have an economy. So there is a complex nuance to how do we do this? Where do we need to focus and spend our efforts and energy? And at the end of the day, as you said, when you do make a pledge and when you are going to put something forward, make sure you state it clearly and you have time-bound goals that can be measured and tracked. And we're really, I say it all the time, still in early innings of this game, but we are seeing a lot of focus on standards and measurement. And I mean, look at the SEC announcement last week. Look at, there was a UN report that came out recently where they're forming an expert group of diverse constituents to focus on helping not only governments, but corporates talk the talk. I mean, walk the walk, right? If you're going to put a pledge out there, this group is going to come in and start saying, hey, how do we help the transportation sector, for example, really understand that they are making progress towards their commitments? So they're focusing on a few different things. They're focusing on, standards and definitions because we all need to be talking the same language. They talk about, is this a credible criteria that we're using to make some of these pledges? So you can't just say 50% by 2050 and have nothing to back it up. And then having a process to track that over time. So is that going to be in public-facing consumer sustainability reports? Is it part of more, auditable, like carbon accounting standards that have yet to be released? So it's still early innings, but it's important that everybody understands if you're going to say that you're going to do something, you must follow through.
Tyler, this report from the UN, it's really kind of urgent in its language, and I really enjoy that the UN is now calling on governments to be the leading change, because I feel like for a while there's been a lot of pressure on the individual to make these changes, and while that is important, my changes feed in just a little bit, right? Whereas you've got to kind of have this top-down approach when it comes to sustainability. Can you talk about some of the calls that the UN is now putting out to these governments, specifically of G20 industrialized countries?
Yeah, they're really not pointing the finger. They're really providing an opportunity for these developed countries to step up. There's another report that's going to come out later today from the IPCC, which is the Panel on Climate Change. And they've had several of these reports come out over the last 6 months. They do them in a series of 4 over a year. So we've seen the one on the current trajectory of warming. We've seen another one on the potential impacts of warming. And the one coming out later today will be on policies, procedures, and technologies that you can implement to reduce global warming. So recommendations on what we need to be focused on right now across all sectors. So I'm really excited to read that report and see what's different from the last one they came out with. But it is a call on government, to your point, to say, hey, policymakers set the table and industry cooks the meal, right? We understand that. And when we isolate this conversation to freight and logistics, we understand that you have a ecosystem of providers that are operating within boundaries that they didn't set. And they're just trying to survive and make money and deliver service and goods, right? If government came out and said tomorrow, like they have done, hey, we're going to start to ratchet up fuel economy standards for heavy duty trucking, which Biden's EPA is looking to do, well, now that changes the boundaries that operators have to work within, and especially OEMs. So that snowball starts at the top of the mountain, to your point, and it's going to roll downhill, and everybody's going to have to adapt and react. But markets work that way, and they've always worked that way. So you can't just have no rules, because then you have bad actors taking advantage of everybody. Finding the balance of policy that is supportive and not burdensome, that's the tricky part. I mean, look at how this industry has adapted with ELDs, right? Like that was a 10-year implementation process that was fought kicking and screaming all along the way. And I don't know that everybody would agree and say, hey, this has been successful and done everything we wanted it to do, right? I think there's some subjectivity in the results, but the upshot of that and externality that's benefiting everybody is we have a lot more data now on how these trucks are moving, where they're going, how drivers are driving, so we can make more informed decisions. So, that's an example of a policy that has a desired outcome and then additional benefits that come out of it. And I'm sure there's been costs too. I know at the time when it was implemented, we lost a lot of capacity because people weren't going to onboard and get shut down by not complying. So there's no silver bullet. And that's why I am so adamant about getting everyone's attention on this same issue, because if we're like directionally right and moving the ball down the field, we're still making progress.
And Tyler, one of the things that you mentioned earlier that I definitely want to hear you dig into a little bit more is what can be done right now, because when I think of large corporations making pledges by 2050, 2060, I can make these pledges, but I'm going to be out of the game by then. That's going to be someone else's problem. When we're looking at some of those commitments that are really far down the line, do you see that there might be a lack of initiative to take any kind of accountability earlier because I'm going to be out of the area or I won't be participating anymore?
Yes, that is a danger. I do think you're starting to see more focus on near-term targets. So if you're setting a long-term goal, it's got to be, scientifically backed and in writing, not necessarily legal, but in writing. But we're starting to see that coming, from the finance industry and the C-suite, pushing near-term incentives as like performance metrics for managers and for, supply chain leaders specifically. So if we're going to now say, it's a logical exercise. If we say this is our goal, right? If you're training for a marathon, you're going to say, hey, in 6 months, I've got to be running this many miles at this time. You're not just going to wake up 2 weeks before, because then you're dead. You're going to kill yourself trying to run the race, or you won't achieve your goals. And there's some sort of backlash from that, right? So you start putting these incremental metrics in place, and you start pursuing what can we do now. So to answer your question initially, Kaylee, what can we do now in freight and logistics? Start measuring your emissions yesterday. Understand where and how you have hotspots in your network. If you're a shipper, that could include and should include your long tail of indirect freight spend, so your scope 3 network. You need to understand and at least have a directionally accurate benchmark for where your emissions are. And then as you're working with other groups, demand forecasting and sales and marketing, what's our growth going to be over the coming years? You need to incorporate some sort of fundamental metric around emissions, whether that's gram CO2 per ton mile delivered. That's a metric that cuts across lots of different sectors, because it takes the heavy haul or lightweight equation out of the trailer. Or out of the metric. So I would say measure. And then offsetting is not a bad thing to do today, as long as it's done with quality offsets and you're not making claims that are not good. So you're always going to get funny looks when you are, sending up a smokestack and saying, hey, we're delivering carbon neutral goods. But if you can tell that story and you're supporting a project that is demonstrating value both to biodiversity and local economies, and you're removing carbon at the same time, there should be a lot of political goodwill there, because the reality is you're not going to run your entire fleet on EVs tomorrow. It's going to take time. We're still going to need the grid to decarbonize in that scenario, or we're going to need some sort of advanced biofuel or electrofuel that's going to reduce carbon at the point of consumption on the truck. So that's a long-term game. So in the meantime, if you are going to contribute in a climate finance positive way through offsets, that's awesome. Just make sure you're appropriately claiming what you should be and not trying to greenwash your operations, right? You're still emitting. So those are the simplest way to say it, Anthony, right? Measure, reduce where you can, and then offset the way to the end until you get to zero.
And rinse and repeat, right? Over and over and over again.
Over and over. Exactly.
Tyler, we talk a lot about consumers choosing to kind of vote with their dollar when it comes to supporting companies who are maybe making climate pledges or who are actually doing the things they say they're doing and not just greenwashing their products. And I think that we can also boil that down into the freight and transportation spend as well, right? If you're a company and you're thinking, okay, how can I reduce my scope 2, scope 3 emissions? You can make the choice to do business with these people, right? And eventually, if in a perfect world, if we got everybody to make those choices, it would fall into place, and then we would have people only supporting people who are doing the right thing. Can you talk about changing that mindset maybe in your company a little bit? And if you don't have that mindset of supporting those folks who are walking the walk, maybe starting to change that?
Definitely. I mean, if you're a shipper that has real climate goals and your organization cares about this issue, you need to be supporting your suppliers that are trying to deliver those sustainable solutions to you. And it might cost more today, but that's okay, because you can take advantage of telling that story to your customers on what you're doing, and you should be making progress towards your goals at the same time. So I would encourage the shipping community, as you're measuring and figuring out where within your scope 3 you're going to reduce, you have to work and get in bed with some of your suppliers to get these more expensive solutions today on the road, piloted, get them to commercial scale, and put them in the geographies where it makes sense to you. If you're a fleet or a logistics service provider, this is a point of differentiation for you. You need to be researching where you can deploy some of these and tell that story to your shippers and try to stratify your offering, because there should be a premium for some of these green services. If customers really want to hit their ESG targets, they're going to need to incentivize their suppliers to get there. So that could look in the form of a higher rate. That could look in the form of a longer term contract. That could be more dedicated moves. There's lots of options to get creative. You could be collaborating with other shippers on working with a select group of suppliers to try and optimize networks. You should be trying to reduce empty miles anyway. Convoy is a big sponsor, and that's what they do. It's a pretty low-hanging fruit lever to pull. But there's no reason why you shouldn't view this as an opportunity instead of waiting for policy burdens to come down. The whole logistics and freight sector needs to view this as an opportunity to provide value at a higher rate with better service while doing good for the planet.
Yeah, Tyler, I think that's a great point, being able to utilize digital freight networks to really be able to dive into, like you said, those low-hanging fruit right there. You brought up Convoy. They're also the sponsor for your podcast as well, Net Zero Carbon. When you're looking up at the upcoming weeks, upcoming weeks, what are some of the guests that you have lined up? What are going to be some of the talking points that you're going to be featuring over there?
As always, we got great ones coming up. We had Jennifer from Convoy last week talking about everything they're doing in their latest sustainability report. The next 2 weeks, we've got a large Eastern U.S. focused asset carrier operator talking about their decarbonization strategies. And then we have one of the world's largest 3PLs talking about what they're doing as well within their network. So next 2 weeks will be focused on the logistics service providers. Tune in Fridays at 1. You don't want to miss it.
And then following that, of course, as we mentioned, we've got the event. Is there a certain session or a speaker that you're really looking forward to the most?
At the summit? Mm-hmm. We've got, I can't reveal some of the names yet, but we've got someone from the DOT who's coming in, who's going to give us a good picture of what they're thinking about from sustainability and freight, and even as part of the infrastructure package, right, and how that's going to roll out. And then we've got some really unique tech providers who are coming in to provide not only visibility so you can measure and reduce, but also actually providing ways to alter the technology on the assets themselves so that you can start cutting emissions today. So it's going to be good.
Tyler. Well, we're looking forward to that one. Head to live.freightwaves.com, get registered for that event on Earth Day. It's free to do so. We'll talk to you next week.
Have a great one, y'all. Thanks.